The morning sky hung gray over Chicago's south side on August 29, 1886. Summer heat pressed down on the working-class neighborhood of Brighton Park like a heavy hand. Inside the elegant Italianate mansion at 36th and Western Boulevard, Junot Whitehouse stood at his window, looking out over the sprawling gunpowder works below. The brick smokestacks reached toward the clouds. The wooden warehouses sat in neat rows. Everything looked perfect. Everything looked safe. Thunder rolled in the distance. At 10:30 in the morning, a single bolt of lightning changed everything. It struck one of the powder magazines with such force that the earth itself seemed to scream. The explosion that followed wasn't just loud. It was the sound of an empire ending. The shockwave ripped through Brighton Park like the hand of God, leaving a 20-foot crater where men had worked just moments before. Windows shattered 6 miles away in downtown Chicago, where wealthy businessmen lunged from their desks at the Board of Trade. Hotel guests along Michigan Avenue dove for cover as their windows exploded inward, showering luxury carpets with broken glass. 3 men died instantly in the blast. Their names have been lost to history, buried like their bodies in the rubble of America's hunger for expansion. But before we talk about the tragedy, before we examine how quickly fortune can turn to dust, we need to understand just how beautiful the dream looked at the beginning. The mansion that gunpowder built was a monument to possibility. Constructed between 1875 and 1876 by the architectural firm of Oscar Cobb and Company, it rose from the prairie like something out of a European fairy tale. 3 stories of red brick, perfectly symmetrical, with tall arched windows that caught the morning light and turned it golden. The architectural style was pure Italianate, a fashion statement that screamed wealth in the language of towers, brackets, and ornate cornices. This wasn't just a house, this was a declaration. In today's money, adjusted for inflation, the construction costs would exceed $3 million. For a superintendent's residence, for a man who managed other men who made explosives, think about that for a moment. The sheer scale of the investment. The DuPont Company didn't build modest homes for its managers, they built palaces. Because in 1876, when this house rose from the Chicago soil, the DuPont name meant something that younger generations can barely comprehend. Founded in 1802 by Eleuthère René DuPont, a French immigrant who had fled the chaos of the French Revolution, the company had become America's premier manufacturer of black powder. When the nation needed to blast through mountains to lay railroad tracks, they called DuPont. When miners needed to tunnel deep into the earth for gold and silver and coal, they used DuPont explosives. When the Union Army needed gunpowder during the Civil War, they purchased 4 million barrels from this single family-owned company. 4 million barrels. The wealth this generated was almost incomprehensible. By the 1870s, the DuPont family had built a dynasty that would eventually span more than 2 centuries. They would own estates along the Brandywine River in Delaware, mansions that would later become public museums and gardens. Names like Winterthur, Nemers, and Longwood would become synonymous with American aristocracy. These weren't just rich people. These were the architects of industrial America, the men whose products quite literally blew holes through mountains to make way for progress. And in Brighton Park, Chicago, they needed a foothold. They needed a superintendent who could oversee the daily operations of manufacturing death on an industrial scale. They needed someone who could manage the workers, ensure quality control, and sleep at night knowing that below his elegant home, thousands of pounds of explosives sat waiting in wooden buildings. If these stories of depth and ambition matter to you, If you're drawn to histories that look beneath the surface rather than skim across it, then what comes next will matter too. These narratives take time to research, to write, to shape into something that honors both the grandeur and the cost. Your support through a subscription is what makes that possible. Junot Whitehouse was that man. We don't know much about Whitehouse's early life. History has a way of erasing the middle managers, the men who ran the operations but didn't own the company. We know he was educated, competent, and trusted with enormous responsibility. We know that when he requested a residence near the powder works, he asked for a small house. The company's response was to build him a 3-story mansion that still stands today, a testament to how little the word small meant to people with gunpowder money. The location was strategic, built on Western Boulevard with a commanding view of the entire gunpowder complex. The house allowed Whitehouse to literally watch over his domain. From his windows on the 2nd and 3rd floors, he could see the packing houses, the mixing rooms, the magazines where finished powder awaited shipment. He could monitor the comings and goings of workers, many of them immigrants who had come to Chicago seeking the American dream, and found instead dangerous work that paid decent wages. Germans, Bohemians, Irish men with families to feed and no other options. They worked with materials that could ignite from a spark, a careless moment, a stroke of bad luck. The house itself was a marvel of 1870s craftsmanship. The interior featured hand-carved wooden banisters that spiraled up to the 2nd floor. Built-in bookcases lined the walls of the library, marble fireplaces anchored each major room, their mantels decorated with intricate scrollwork. The ceilings soared 12 feet high on the main floor, creating a sense of space and grandeur that made visitors feel small. Large windows throughout the house ensured abundant natural light, important in an era before electric lighting became common. The kitchen, located in the rear of the house, was separate from the main living areas, a design feature that kept cooking smells and heat away from the family's living spaces. This was luxury, this was comfort, this was what success looked like in Gilded Age America. But beneath that comfort, beneath the hand-carved banisters and the marble fireplaces, the entire fortune rested on a foundation of controlled violence. Understanding the gunpowder business requires understanding the constant dance with death. Black powder, the explosive that built the DuPont fortune, is a mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur. Simple ingredients, deadly combination. When properly mixed and handled, it's stable enough to transport and store. But introduce moisture, create friction, generate static electricity, or expose it to flame, and the result is catastrophic. The powder doesn't just burn. It explodes with such force that it can level buildings, create craters in solid earth, and kill everyone in the vicinity. The workers who manufactured this product understood the risks. They had to. The DuPont Company, for all its wealth and power, had a reputation in the industry. Between the founding of the Brandywine Mills in Delaware in 1802 and their closing in 1921, there were 288 recorded explosions at DuPont facilities. 228 people died in those explosions, not over decades, not over a century. Over the course of the company's operation, an explosion occurred roughly every 5 months. Some were minor, destroying a single building and perhaps killing 1 or 2 workers. Others were catastrophic. In 1890, an explosion at the upper yard in Delaware caused such extensive damage that it was felt as far away as Philadelphia. Workers' homes, built near the powder yards so employees could walk to work, were damaged or destroyed. Families who had lived in company housing suddenly found themselves homeless, their belongings buried under rubble, their breadwinners dead or maimed. The company would rebuild. The company always rebuilt. But the people didn't always recover. In 1915, the packing house explosion in Delaware killed 30 people, many of them young employees, some barely out of their teenage years. It remains the second deadliest explosion in the history of the Brandywine Mills. The victims included children of the workers who had died in previous explosions, continuing cycles of tragedy that haunted some families for generations. And these were the Delaware operations, the flagship mills where the DuPont family lived, where company executives could directly oversee operations. Imagine the risks at satellite operations like the Brighton Park facility in Chicago, where oversight was less direct, where local managers like Whitehouse had to make daily decisions about safety versus production, where the pressure to meet demand constantly pushed against the need for caution. Before we continue, pause here. If you're still watching, if you're still present for this story, it's because you understand that these histories aren't just about the past. They are about the patterns that shaped our present. The decisions made in that mansion, in those powder yards, echo in every workplace where profit weighs against safety. Drop a like if that recognition landed, if you feel it too, not for entertainment, for acknowledgement. Brighton Park in the 1870s and 1880s was not the residential neighborhood it would later become. It was an industrial zone chosen specifically because it was far enough from downtown Chicago to minimize complaints about the danger, but close enough to take advantage of the city's rail connections and shipping infrastructure. The area had originally been a livestock town, called the town of Brighton after the animal markets of London. A stockyard had stood at the intersection of Blue Island Avenue and Archer Avenue, where farmers brought cattle and pigs from outlying areas. But when the Union stockyards consolidated operations in 1864, Brighton's livestock economy collapsed overnight. The land sat waiting for someone to see its potential. The DuPont Company saw a location perfectly suited for gunpowder manufacturing, far enough from dense population centers to avoid immediate complaints, close enough to railroads to ship products efficiently, cheap enough that the company could acquire large parcels for their operations. The local post office was briefly called Factoryville, until someone realized another Illinois town already had that name. The area around the DuPont works became known simply as the Powder Mills neighborhood. The company built an extensive complex. Multiple buildings spread across the property, each serving a specific function in the manufacturing process. Mixing houses where workers combined the raw ingredients, pressing mills where the mixture was compacted into cakes, granulating buildings where the cakes were broken down into grains of specific sizes, packing houses where finished product was loaded into kegs, and magazines, those crucial storage buildings where finished powder awaited shipment, buildings that needed to be isolated from the manufacturing areas in case of explosion. The whole operation employed dozens of workers at any given time. They worked long hours, 6 days a week, handling materials that could kill them at any moment. The pay was decent, better than what most unskilled laborers could earn in other industries. But the work came with an understanding, an unspoken agreement that everyone who clocked in knew they might not clock out. Families of powder workers lived with a constant awareness that the man who left for work in the morning might not return that evening. This was the world Junot Whitehouse oversaw from his Italianate mansion on the hill. Every morning he would have watched the workers arrive, filing through the gates into the complex. Every evening he would have watched them leave, tired and covered in black dust, heading home to small houses and rented rooms in the surrounding area. A few workers had families who lived in company, provided housing near the works. Others boarded in rooming houses, sending most of their wages back to families in Germany or Ireland or Bohemia. They were the invisible machinery of American progress, the men whose labor and risk generated profits that built mansions and funded family dynasties. The summer of 1886 was hot and dry. Lightning storms swept across the Midwest with increasing frequency as August wore on. In the powder industry, lightning was one of the most feared hazards. Unlike sparks from machinery or careless smoking, lightning couldn't be controlled or prevented. When storms approached, workers were supposed to cease operations and evacuate the powder magazines. But in an industry where time was money, where production quotas had to be met and shipping schedules had to be honored, the temptation to work through warnings must have been constant. On August 29, 1886, that gamble came due. The lightning strike came without warning. One moment the sky was heavy with clouds. The next moment a bolt of electricity found one of the powder magazines. The explosion that followed was unlike anything Brighton Park had ever experienced. The detonation created a shockwave that propagated outward at supersonic speed, a wall of compressed air that shattered windows for miles. The heat of the blast was so intense that anything combustible within hundreds of feet simply vaporized. The sound, described by witnesses as like the earth splitting open, was heard across the entire city of Chicago. 3 men died instantly. We don't know their names. History didn't record them. They weren't company executives or family members. They were workers, probably immigrants, men whose names appeared on payroll sheets and nowhere else. The explosion that killed them created a crater 20 feet deep and 40 feet across. The magazine itself simply ceased to exist, reduced to splinters and ash. Other buildings in the complex were damaged by the blast, their walls cracked, their roofs partially collapsed. The White House mansion, built solid with thick brick walls, survived the explosion structurally, but the psychological impact must have been devastating. To stand at your window and watch the place you manage literally explode, to know that men you supervised, men whose names you knew, men whose families lived nearby, had just died under your watch. To understand that the same disaster could have occurred yesterday or might occur tomorrow. Chicago's response to the explosion was immediate and unforgiving. Newspaper editorials demanded that gunpowder manufacturing be banned from the city limits. Residents who had long complained about the danger suddenly had their worst fears confirmed. The explosion had shattered windows at the Board of Trade building downtown, 6 miles from the blast site. Hotel windows along Michigan Avenue had burst inward. If the explosion had been larger, if more magazines had detonated in a chain reaction, the death toll could have been catastrophic. The DuPont Company had no choice. After heated exchanges with residents and city officials, the decision was made to relocate the Brighton Park operations to Blue Island, Illinois, a more rural area further from residential populations. The gunpowder business would leave Brighton Park forever. The workers would either relocate or find new employment. The complex that had transformed the neighborhood from a failed livestock town into an industrial center would be dismantled and sold for scrap. And the White House mansion, the three-story monument to gunpowder money, sat empty on its hill, overlooking an abandoned industrial wasteland. Now comes a crossroads, a moment that defined not just this property, but an entire neighborhood's future. The choices made in the aftermath of that explosion would ripple forward through generations. If you've stayed this far, you understand that these turning points matter. They're the hinges upon which entire communities swing between prosperity and abandonment. Consider subscribing, not for what's already been said, but for the commitment to tell these complete stories, to follow the threads all the way through to their ends. The story could have ended there. Mansion abandoned, powder works demolished, neighborhood returning to prairie grass and silence. But real estate has a way of surviving, of finding new purposes, of refusing to die even when its original reason for existence has vanished. In 1900, a developer named Joseph McCaffrey purchased the White House mansion and the surrounding property. McCaffrey had vision. While others saw an abandoned industrial zone, he saw residential potential. The powder works were gone, but the railroads remained. The location was still closed to downtown Chicago, but with land cheap enough for working-class families to afford. McCaffrey began buying up parcels throughout Brighton Park, subdividing them, selling lots, and encouraging construction of 2 flats and 3 flats, the classic Chicago working-class housing stock. McCaffrey became known as the father of Brighton Park, transforming the neighborhood from an industrial zone into a residential community. The mansion became his home, a symbol of his success and his investment in the area's future. He lived there for years, raising his family in rooms that had once belonged to a gunpowder superintendent, sleeping in a house built with explosives money. But the mansion's location, once its greatest asset, had become a liability. Western Boulevard was increasingly valuable as a commercial corridor. The large lot the mansion occupied could be subdivided and sold for more money than the house itself was worth. In 1920, a new development company purchased the land with plans to build a freight depot on the site. The mansion was scheduled for demolition. This is where the story takes its strangest turn. Rather than demolish the house, the company made an extraordinary decision. They would move it not just a few feet, but an entire block west to 36th and Artesian Avenue. In 1920, before modern house, moving equipment existed, before hydraulic jacks and steel beams, they would physically relocate a 3-story brick mansion weighing hundreds of tons. The logistics alone seem impossible by today's standards, but in an era when labor was cheap and engineering, challenges were solved with brute force and ingenuity. The move happened. Imagine the scene: workers digging beneath the foundation, inserting massive wooden beams, teams of horses, dozens of them, harnessed to steel cables attached to the house's frame. The mansion slowly separating from its original foundation, tilting slightly as it rose, then gradually being dragged across unpaved streets to its new location, a block away. Crowds gathering to watch, children running alongside, adults shaking their heads at the audacity of it all. The move took weeks. Every day brought new challenges, new problems to solve, but eventually the mansion settled onto its new foundation at 3558 South Artesian Avenue, where it still stands today. This move was more than just engineering. It was a statement about value and permanence. Even though the house had been built for a purpose that no longer existed, even though it sat on land that was now more valuable empty than occupied, someone decided it was worth saving. The mansion, with its hand-carved banisters and marble fireplaces, represented something about the neighborhood's history that deserved preservation. After the move, the mansion served various purposes. It was divided into apartments at some point, housing multiple families in spaces originally designed for one wealthy household. Different owners came and went, each leaving their mark, each changing the interior to suit their needs. Original architectural details were covered over, removed, or painted over. The built-in bookcases disappeared. Some of the fireplaces were sealed up. The elegant spaces were subdivided into smaller rooms, maximizing rental income but destroying the original floor plan. By the late 20th century, the mansion had fallen into serious disrepair. Years of deferred maintenance, multiple unsympathetic renovations, and general neglect had left it a shadow of its former glory. The roof leaked, windows were broken or boarded up. The interior had been stripped of most original details by various owners and tenants. Squatters occasionally occupied the building. The surrounding neighborhood viewed it as an eyesore, a haunted-looking structure that represented Brighton Park's industrial past rather than its residential present. But then something interesting happened. In 1988, the Chicago Landmarks Commission began investigating the mansion's historical significance. Their research uncovered the full story, from its construction by the DuPont Company to its dramatic relocation in 1920. The house, they determined, was one of the few remaining physical connections to Brighton Park's industrial heritage. It represented an important chapter in Chicago's history, a time when the city's growth was fueled by heavy industry and explosive materials, quite literally. In 1996, the DuPont White House house was officially designated a Chicago landmark. This designation came with certain protections. The exterior couldn't be demolished or significantly altered without approval from the Landmarks Commission. Any restoration work would need to follow specific guidelines to maintain historical accuracy. The designation didn't guarantee funding for restoration, but it did ensure that the building would be preserved rather than razed. For years after the designation, the mansion continued to deteriorate. A landmarked building without an owner willing to invest in restoration is often worse off than a building without protection. The landmark status makes it difficult to demolish, but it also makes it expensive to repair according to the required standards. The house sat vacant and boarded up, a legally protected ruin. This is where the story pivots again. What happened to this mansion mirrors what happened to countless industrial-era structures across America. Buildings that once symbolized progress becoming monuments to obsolescence. The question isn't just about preservation, it's about what we choose to remember and why. Those questions matter more than most people realize. If they matter to you too, if you're still engaged with where this story goes, your continued viewership sends that signal. Not to algorithms, but to the researchers and writers who decide which stories are worth the hundreds of hours required to tell them properly. The early 2000s brought renewed interest in historic preservation throughout Chicago. As the city gentrified and property values rose in formerly working-class neighborhoods, developers began seeing potential in historic structures. The unique architecture, the solid construction, and the cachet of owning a landmarked building appealed to a new generation of buyers. In the case of the DuPont White House house, an investor finally stepped forward with plans to restore the exterior and rehabilitate the interior. The restoration work revealed both the extent of the damage and the quality of the original construction. The brick facade, though weathered, was still structurally sound. The foundation, which had survived both the original construction and the dramatic relocation in 1920, remained solid. But the interior was essentially gutted. Most original details had been removed or destroyed. The restoration team had to work from old photographs and architectural drawings to reconstruct elements like the main staircase and the built-in detail. The exterior restoration was complete. The mansion once again looked much as it had in the 1870s, its red brick cleaned and repointed, its windows repaired and reglazed, its distinctive Italianate cornices and brackets restored. The interior was renovated into modern living spaces, but without the historic documentation needed to recreate the original floor plan. The restoration focused on preserving the building's shells. While creating contemporary interiors, today, the DuPont White House house stands at 3558 South Artesian Avenue, a well-maintained Victorian mansion in a working, class Chicago neighborhood. Most people who pass it have no idea of its history. They don't know it was built with gunpowder money. They don't know 3 men died in an explosion that ultimately forced its construction company to abandon Chicago. They don't know it was physically moved 1 block west to avoid demolition. They see a pretty old house, interesting architecture, maybe a little out of place in a neighborhood of bungalows and 2 flats. But the building remembers. The DuPont story didn't end in Brighton Park in 1886. The company continued to grow, expanding from black powder into smokeless powder, dynamite, and eventually a vast array of chemical products. The DuPont family remained one of America's wealthiest for generations. PRS. DuPont, who became president of DuPont in 1915 and president of General Motors in 1920, was one of the most powerful businessmen in American history. His personal fortune funded the creation of Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania, one of the premier horticultural displays in the world. Other family members built similar estates, creating a legacy of public spaces that continue to benefit millions of visitors annually. The family's wealth, built initially on black powder and explosives, eventually diversified into countless industries. DuPont's development of nylon revolutionized the textile industry. Their work on artificial fibers created entirely new markets. During World War II, DuPont participated in the Manhattan Project, contributing to the development of atomic weapons. The company that started by manufacturing gunpowder in 1802 had, by the mid-20th century, become a chemical giant with operations worldwide. But that growth came with costs that annual reports don't capture: the 288 explosions at the Brandywine Mills, the 228 workers who died in those explosions, the families who lost breadwinners, who lost homes built on company property, who lost futures they had planned based on paychecks that would never arrive, the 3 unnamed men who died in Brighton Park in 1886, the countless workers at facilities around the country who suffered injuries, illness, and death from exposure to dangerous chemicals and explosive materials. The mansion on Artesian Avenue stands as an accidental monument to all of it, to the wealth and the cost, to the grand ambitions and the human price, to the beautiful dream of progress and the explosion that ended it in Brighton Park. There's a particular irony in how the building survived. It was built to house a superintendent, a man whose job was to oversee the daily production of explosive materials. It was constructed with the profits from selling products designed to destroy. When the explosion finally came, when the disaster that everyone in the powder industry knew was possible actually happened, the mansion survived while the works it was built to oversee were abandoned. The house outlasted the industry that created it. This pattern repeats throughout American industrial history. The grand houses survive while the factories crumble. The owners' estates become museums while the workers' neighborhoods decay. We preserve the symbols of wealth while the symbols of labor disappear. In Brighton Park, the White House mansion stands while almost nothing remains of the actual powder works. A few 1880s greystones survive from the era when workers lived near the mills, but the mills themselves are gone, their locations paved over or built upon, their history forgotten except in archives and old photographs. The Brighton Park neighborhood today is predominantly Hispanic, home to working class families, small businesses, and modest homes. The area has no memory of its gunpowder past. School children growing up blocks from the mansion have no idea that their neighborhood was once home to one of the most dangerous industries in 19th century America. The streets where workers once walked to the powder mills now carry traffic to and from the city. The buildings where explosives were manufactured have been replaced by warehouses, auto repair shops, and residential developments. Only the mansion remains, a 3-story Victorian time capsule that refuses to be forgotten. If you're still here, still reading these final passages, you've chosen to see this story through to its end. That choice matters more than you might think. It tells us that there's still an appetite for depth, for stories that don't rush to judgment, but instead take time to understand complexity, to explore not just what happened, but what it meant and what it continues to mean. These stories will keep being told as long as audiences like you signal that they matter. That's what a subscription represents, not just access, but a vote for this kind of storytelling to continue. What should we make of this story? What lessons does the DuPont White House house have for us today? First, it reminds us that every fortune has a foundation, and that foundation is often built on risk, borne by people who saw little of the profits. The DuPont family became one of America's wealthiest dynasties by manufacturing products that killed the workers who made them at a rate of roughly one major explosion every 5 months for over a century. Those explosions weren't accidents in the sense of being unforeseeable. They were the cost of doing business in an industry where profit margins depended on accepting catastrophic risk. Second, it shows us how quickly the justifications for that risk can evaporate. In 1875, building a mansion for a powder works superintendent made perfect sense. The location was ideal, the business was thriving, and Brighton Park seemed destined to become a major industrial center. 11 years later, a single lightning strike and 3 deaths ended that future. The business model that had seemed sustainable for decades collapsed in an instant, revealing how fragile the entire enterprise had always been. Third, it demonstrates the strange durability of physical structures versus human memory. The mansion survives, renovated and protected, while the names of the 3 men who died in the explosion are lost. We preserve the buildings but forget the people. We landmark the architecture but not the lives. The DuPont White House house is a Chicago landmark because of its architectural significance and its connection to the neighborhood's industrial heritage. But there's no landmark, no memorial, no historical marker for the workers who died making the explosives that paid for that architecture. Finally, it raises questions about what we choose to celebrate when we celebrate industrial history. The mansion is beautiful, its preservation is in many ways a good thing, Victorian architecture is worth saving, and the building tells an important story about Chicago's development. But when we admire the hand-carved banisters and the elegant proportions, when we photograph its facade and praise its restoration, are we also celebrating the system that created it? Are we honoring the wealth without acknowledging the cost? The DuPont White House house exists in this complicated space. It's a survivor, a beautiful example of period architecture, a tangible connection to Chicago's industrial past. But it's also a monument to an industry built on catastrophic risk, a symbol of wealth created by selling products that killed, a mansion that outlasted the men whose labor made it possible. On quiet evenings in Brighton Park, when the traffic dies down and the neighborhood settles in for the night, the mansion sits in shadow on Artesian Avenue. Its windows are dark, its brick facade holds the last light of day. The building remembers things that the neighborhood has forgotten, stories that aren't written on any historical plaque, names that don't appear in any official record. The explosion that shook Chicago in 1886 is a footnote in most histories. The 3 men who died are anonymous casualties of industrial progress. The DuPont Company continued to thrive, to grow, to build one of the great American fortunes. The DuPont family estates in Delaware remain tourist attractions, their gardens and mansions celebrated as examples of American achievement and taste. And in Brighton Park, the mansion remains, not as grand as the Delaware estates, not as historically significant as other Chicago landmarks, but persistent. A Threes, Tory brick reminder that every fortune has its foundations, every success has its costs, and sometimes the only thing that survives to tell the story is a house that refuses to fall. What does it mean to preserve such a building? What are we actually saving when we landmark structures like the DuPont White House House? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're worth asking. Because in the space between celebration and condemnation, between preserving history and sanitizing it, we might find something closer to truth. The mansion stands because someone decided it was worth saving. The workers' names are lost because no one thought to record them. The company thrived because profit mattered more than safety. The explosion happened because lightning doesn't respect human ambition. The neighborhood changed because industries rise and fall and cities move on. The house was moved because even in failure, value persists for those who know how to extract it. These are the layered realities of the DuPont White House House. Not a simple story of villainy or heroism, but a complex tale of ambition, risk, tragedy, survival, and the strange ways that history is written, forgotten, and occasionally imperfectly remembered. Through the buildings that refuse to disappear, as we end this journey through the mansion's history, consider what stays with you. Not the architectural details or the dates, though those matter, but the questions, the uncomfortable space between admiring beautiful buildings and acknowledging ugly truths, the distance between the mansion on the hill and the crater in the ground, the gap between names remembered and names forgotten. If this story moved you, if it changed how you see these monuments to industrial history, that change matters. Share it, not because these videos need views, though they do, but because these questions need to be asked by more than just historians and preservation activists. Every city has buildings like this, every neighborhood has forgotten stories, every industrial fortune has its foundation built on risks that someone else bore. The DuPont White House House is one building on one block of one neighborhood in one city, but it's also every building like it. Every mansion built with industry money, every beautiful structure with a complicated past, every landmark that forces us to ask what we're actually preserving when we preserve history. The house remembers, even if we've forgotten, the explosion echoes, even if we can't hear it anymore. The cost remains, even if we've stopped counting. And on Artesian Avenue, in a working-class neighborhood where few people know its history, a three-story brick mansion built with gunpowder money stands against the Chicago sky, beautiful and permanent and silent, keeping its secrets while the city moves on around it, forgetting and remembering in equal measure, the way cities always do, the way they always have, the way they always will. But there's another layer to this story, one that makes the mansion's survival even stranger, one that connects it to a pattern repeating across America right now, in this moment, as you read these words. The restoration of the DuPont White House House wasn't just about preserving history, it was about real estate. By the 2010s, when the renovation was finally completed, Brighton Park was changing again. Chicago's endless cycle of neighborhood transformation was reaching even this working-class corner of the South Side. Property values were rising. Developers were looking at areas they had ignored for decades. And historic buildings, buildings with landmark status and interesting stories, suddenly became valuable in ways that had nothing to do with history. A renovated Victorian mansion in a neighborhood where most houses are modest bungalows and tooth. That stands out. It attracts a different kind of buyer, someone willing to pay more, someone who sees value in uniqueness, in architectural distinction, in having something their neighbors don't have. The mansion that Gunpowder built became, more than a century later, a tool for gentrification. This creates a strange circle. The building was constructed with profits from an industry that exploited workers and accepted their deaths as a cost of doing business. It survived because it was too valuable to destroy, first for its materials, then for its historical significance. And now it survives as a premium property in a neighborhood where rising housing costs are pushing out the same kinds of working-class families that the original powder mill workers belonged to. The people who live near the mansion today, the families who walk past it on their way to work or school, many of them are one rent increase away from being forced out of Brighton Park entirely. They're not being killed by explosions, they're being killed by economics, different mechanism, same result. The invisible hand of the market pushing people aside so that wealth can find its next investment opportunity. Think about that irony. The mansion survived the explosion that killed 3 workers. It survived the company's departure. It survived decades of neglect. It survived being physically moved 1 block. And now, restored and protected, it's part of a process that mirrors the original displacement of the powder mill workers. Except this time, it's not one explosion forcing sudden relocation. It's a slow pressure, year after year, rent increase after rent increase, property tax hike after property tax hike, until whole families simply can't afford to stay. The DuPont family would understand this perfectly. They were masters of long-term thinking, of building systems that generated wealth across generations. Pierre S. DuPont didn't just run a company, he helped shape the entire structure of modern American capitalism. His work at General Motors established patterns of corporate organization that dominated the 20th century. His investments in infrastructure and education created frameworks that still influence how wealth flows and accumulates. And the mansion in Brighton Park, that small outpost of the DuPont empire, continues to participate in those same patterns. Not actively, not intentionally, but by existing, by surviving, by being renovated and valued, it plays its role in the machinery of wealth concentration. There's something almost supernatural about it, as if the building itself carries a purpose that transcends its original function. It was built to house a man who oversaw the manufacture of explosives. When that purpose ended, it found new purposes. A developer's home, apartments, an abandoned shell, a restoration project, and now a symbol of neighborhood change. Each era gives it a new meaning, but the underlying pattern remains constant. The building serves wealth. It always has. Some neighbors report strange things about the mansion, not ghosts in the traditional sense, but odd synchronicities. Businesses near the building that seemed stable suddenly closing. Families who lived in the area for generations abruptly moving away. As if there's a radius around the mansion where permanence becomes impossible for anyone without sufficient resources to resist the pressure. This is probably just coincidence. Property values rise, neighborhoods change. Chicago has been churning through cycles of transformation since its founding. Brighton Park is just the latest area to experience what dozens of other neighborhoods have already gone through. The mansion isn't cursed, it's just valuable, and value, in a market economy, exerts its own kind of pressure on everything around it. But the timing is worth noting. The mansion sat abandoned for decades with relatively little impact on the surrounding area. Property values stayed low. The neighborhood remained stable, affordable, working class. Then the restoration began. The landmark designation brought attention, the renovation brought investment. And suddenly, Brighton Park was on lists of up-and-coming neighborhoods, places where young professionals might find affordable alternatives to more expensive areas closer to downtown. The people making those lists, writing those articles, creating those investment portfolios, they have no idea about the explosion in 1886. They don't know about the 3 dead workers. They don't know the mansion was built with gunpowder money. They just see architecture, location, potential returns on investment. The history is irrelevant except as a marketing point. Victorian charm, historic character, unique property in an emerging market, and maybe that's the real curse. Not that the building is haunted by the ghosts of dead workers, but that it perpetuates, across generations, the same fundamental pattern that created it. Wealth extracting value from labor, buildings surviving while people are displaced, beauty maintained while communities are disrupted. The physical structure outlasting the human connections that gave a place meaning. Before we close, sit with this question for a moment. What would justice look like for a building like this should it have been demolished, removing its influence from the neighborhood? Should it remain abandoned, a visible scar reminding everyone of costs unpaid, or is preservation the right choice, even knowing it might accelerate displacement? There's no comfortable answer, and maybe that discomfort is the point. If you've wrestled with these questions alongside this story, if you understand that history isn't neat and preservation isn't innocent, then you've already chosen depth over simplicity. Share this with someone who makes the same choice, not to agree but to think. That's what matters. The DuPont Company itself exists now only in fragments. In 2017, after more than 2 centuries, it merged with Dow Chemical to form Dow DuPont, which then split into 3 separate companies. The original DuPont, the gunpowder manufacturer founded by a French immigrant in 1802, no longer exists as an independent entity. It was absorbed, restructured, divided. Even giants die, even dynasties end, but the mansion remains. Smaller than the Delaware estates, less significant than the factories, but more stubborn than any of them. While the company that built it has been dissolved and reformed and split apart, while the families that owned it have scattered across generations and geographies, while the workers who died in explosion have been forgotten so completely that we don't even know their names, the building sits on Artesian Avenue, red brick and white trim, 3 stories of Victorian confidence refusing to acknowledge that its original purpose disappeared 138 years ago. This is what power looks like when you give it enough time. Not monuments that shout their importance, but structures that simply refuse to leave. Buildings that adapt to each new era, finding new purposes, new owners, new meanings, but never surrendering the fundamental fact of their existence. The mansion was built to serve wealth, and it continues to serve wealth, and it will continue to serve wealth until someone makes a deliberate choice to break that pattern. Could that happen? Could the DuPont White House become something else? Could it be converted into a community center, a museum, a space that serves the neighborhood rather than serving property values? Technically, yes, landmark status doesn't prevent alternative uses, but landmark status also doesn't fund them. And in a city where money flows toward profit rather than preservation, where investment goes where returns are highest, the path of least resistance is always the same. The building will be sold to whoever can afford it. They will appreciate its history. They will maintain its facade. And the cycle will continue. We can't undo the past. We can't bring back the 3 workers who died in the explosion. We can't compensate their families or restore their names to history. We can't unbuild the DuPont fortune or redistribute the generational wealth it created. All of that is permanent, fixed beyond our reach, but we can choose how we tell these stories. We can choose whether to celebrate the mansion's survival without questioning what that survival means. We can choose whether to admire Victorian architecture without thinking about Victorian labor practices. We can choose whether to preserve buildings without preserving the context that explains why they exist. Those choices matter not because they change the past, but because they shape how we understand the present. Every time someone walks past the DuPont White House and thinks it's just a pretty old building, that's a choice. Every time a real estate listing mentions its historic charm without mentioning the explosion, that's a choice. Every time we landmark architecture without landmarking the people who built it or died for it, that's a choice. And those choices accumulate, they build patterns, they create new foundations, they construct the framework for how the next generation will understand wealth and labor and risk and cost. The mansion isn't just a relic of the past. It's actively shaping the future by determining what we remember and what we forget. So here we are at the end of this story, but also at the beginning of your story with this information. You now know something that most people don't. You know the DuPont White House exists. You know how it was built. You know what it cost. You know it survived. And you know it continues to play its role in the same economic patterns that created it. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. Maybe nothing. Maybe you'll forget this story by tomorrow. Maybe it'll become one more interesting fact filed away in the back of your mind, mentioned occasionally at dinner parties when the conversation turns to Victorian architecture or Chicago history or industrial disasters, or maybe it'll change how you see buildings, how you think about preservation, how you understand the relationship between physical structures and economic systems. Maybe the next time you see a historic mansion or a landmark building or a beautifully restored Victorian, you'll pause. You'll wonder, you'll ask questions that aren't answered by the architectural style or the date of construction. This is how awareness spreads, not through dramatic revelations, but through quiet accumulation of knowledge that gradually shifts how we perceive the world around us. One story, one building, one forgotten explosion, one persistent mansion, and suddenly everything looks different. The DuPont White House stands on Artesian Avenue, waiting, not for redemption, not for judgment. Just existing, being, surviving, doing what it's always done, serving its purpose in the machinery of capital and value and accumulated wealth. Unchanged by our understanding or our criticism or our attempts to complicate its meaning, but we can change. We can see it clearly. We can tell its full story. We can refuse to let the beauty distract from the cost. We can hold both truths simultaneously. The mansion is worth preserving, and the system that created it was brutal. The architecture is beautiful, and the foundation is built on death. History matters, and history is rarely simple. If you've made it this far, truly this far, you've already demonstrated something rare, the patience to sit with complexity, the willingness to see monuments as more than monuments, the capacity to hold contradictions without rushing to resolve them. That's valuable. That's important. That's what keeps these stories alive in meaningful ways rather than flattening them into simple morality tales or heritage tourism. Leave a comment, not a reaction, a thought. What pattern does this illuminate in your own city, your own neighborhood, your own understanding of how the past shapes the present? That's the conversation worth having. That's what turns a story into something that lives beyond its telling. The lightning struck on August 29, 1886. The explosion killed 3 men. The company left. The mansion survived. It was moved, it was abandoned, it was restored, it was landmarked, it continues. And in that continuation, in that stubborn refusal to disappear, in that adaptation to each new era while maintaining its fundamental character, the DuPont White House tells us something essential about how power works, how wealth persists, how systems perpetuate themselves across generations, and how the stories we tell about our buildings shape the stories we tell about ourselves. The house remembers what we've forgotten. The explosion echoes in the brick and mortar, even if we can't hear it. The three dead workers exist in the negative space of historical records that never recorded their names. And on Artesian Avenue in Brighton Park, in Chicago, in America, a 3-story Victorian mansion built with gunpowder money stands as testament to the complicated truth that beauty and brutality aren't opposites, they're partners. They build empires together. They survive together. They tell their story together if we're willing to listen to the whole thing.